Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving into some of the most disturbing chapters in scientific history. These aren't fictional horror stories. These actually happened. So buckle up, because what you're about to hear will shock you. Before we start, I want to emphasize that these experiments were horrific violations of human rights, and sharing these stories is important to ensure we never repeat these mistakes. Human vivisections. Let's start our journey in ancient Alexandria, around 300 BC. Picture this, the greatest library in the world. Scholars from everywhere. Two Greek doctors named Syphilis and Erasistratus, who were about to change medicine forever, but at a terrible cost. They wanted to understand how the human body worked, but dissecting corpses was forbidden. They convinced the rulers of Alexandria to give them live prisoners, condemned criminals, who became their unwilling test subjects. These doctors performed vivisections, live dissections on conscious human beings with no anesthesia. They would cut open stomachs, examine beating hearts, and slice through nerves while victims screamed in agony. They did this in public demonstrations, like twisted medical theater. Crowds would gather to watch as these doctors explored human anatomy by torturing people to death. They mapped the nervous system, identified the brain as the center of intelligence, and distinguished between arteries and veins. But every piece of knowledge came at the cost of unimaginable human suffering. Project 4.1. Fast forward to 1954, the Cold War is raging, and the United States just detonated Castle Bravo, a hydrogen bomb 1,000 times more powerful than the one dropped on Hiroshima. But here's the twisted part. They didn't evacuate the local population from the Marshall Islands. Instead, they saw an opportunity. What if they could study the effects of radiation on living humans? Enter Project 4.1, a secret program that essentially turned 239 innocent islanders into human guinea pigs. The military commanders watched as these people developed radiation sickness, hair falling out, skin peeling off, internal bleeding. Women suffered miscarriages, children developed cancer, and entire families were destroyed. For 20 years, American doctors continued their studies, watching as these people died slow, painful deaths from radiation-induced cancers. When confronted about this decades later, officials claimed it was all just an unfortunate accident. But declassified documents tell a different story. They knew exactly what they were doing. The Kamera. In Soviet Russia, political enemies had a nasty habit of mysteriously dying. Heart attacks, sudden illnesses, unexplained deaths. But these weren't accidents. They were the result of a secret laboratory called the Chamber. Hidden away from the world, Soviet scientists were developing the perfect poison. Colorless, odorless, tasteless, and undetectable. But how do you test such weapons? You need human subjects, of course. Prisoners from labor camps became unwilling test subjects. They were told they were receiving medicine, but instead, they were being slowly murdered with experimental toxins. The scientists tested everything. Ricin that caused internal agony, cyanide that triggered violent seizures, and their masterpiece, a compound that simply made people give up. This final poison was terrifying in its subtlety. Victims didn't scream or convulse. They just became weak, lost hope, and quietly died within minutes. It was liquid despair in a bottle. The most disturbing part? Many of these poisons were later used to assassinate real targets. Every death represented not just murder, but the suffering of countless test subjects who died to perfect these weapons. Guatemalan syphilis study. You might have heard about the Tuskegee experiments, where American doctors let African Americans die from untreated syphilis. But what they did in Guatemala was even worse. They actually infected people on purpose. Between 1946 and 1948, American researchers traveled to Guatemala with a horrifying plan. They would intentionally infect over 1,300 people, including children, with syphilis and gonorrhea to test treatments. Dr. John Cutler, the man in charge, showed no mercy. He infected people through open wounds, contaminated injections, and even arranged for infected prostitutes to spread the disease. His victims included orphans, mental patients, and prisoners who had no idea what was happening to them. One case stands out: a woman named Berta in a psychiatric hospital. They first gave her a harmful illness, and when she became sick, they added another infection to her eyes and body. They watched her suffer for months, documenting every horrific detail as her body deteriorated. She eventually passed away in great pain, and her suffering did not help any medical research. The worst part? When penicillin became available as a cure, they deliberately withheld treatment. These people suffered and died for nothing. The results were never even published. Unit 731. Now we come to perhaps the darkest chapter in this entire story. Unit 731, Japan's biological warfare facility during World War II. Located in occupied China, this facility masqueraded as a lumber mill, but inside, Japanese scientists were conducting secret experiments. They didn't even consider their victims human. They called them logs. The experiments were designed to test the absolute limits of human endurance and suffering. They would freeze people alive to study frostbite, then thaw them out to see what happened. They performed surgery without anesthesia, removing organs from conscious victims. Some of the worst experiments involved biological weapons. They infected people with plague, anthrax, and other diseases. Pregnant women were infected to see how diseases affected unborn children, then subjected to live dissections. Former staff described it as playing around, like children torturing insects, except these were human beings. They would throw grenades at tied-up prisoners just to study blast injuries, or hang people upside down until they died. By the war's end, hundreds of thousands had died in these facilities. As Soviet forces approached, the Japanese destroyed all evidence and executed the remaining prisoners. You'd think justice would follow, right? Wrong. Here's the most infuriating part of this entire story. Most of these monsters were never punished. The American government cut deals with Unit 731 scientists, trading immunity for their research data. The Soviet poison laboratory operated for decades before quietly shutting down. The Guatemala experiment doctors received promotions and honors. The Marshall Islands radiation researchers published papers and advanced their careers. These stories aren't just historical curiosities. They're warnings. They show us what happens when scientific curiosity abandons human compassion, when governments value data over dignity, and when ordinary people become complicit in extraordinary evil. The victims of these experiments didn't die in vain if we remember their suffering and ensure it never happens again. That's why we tell these stories, not to shock or entertain, but to honor their memory and guard against such horrors in our own time. Thanks for watching, and remember, the price of knowledge should never be paid in human suffering. I'll see you in the next video.